With the publicity which centred upon the Todd kidnapping case, for which Montague Todd was jailed for 2 years, Jeeves gained his established reputation as a man of the world. As from this time, his advice was sought throughout Mayfair. It was this affair, moreover, which brought him the friendship of Lord Peter Wimsey's man, Bunter.
You will have realized, Jeeves, that my master, Lord Peter Wimsey, is an extremely clever man.
Of that there can be no doubt.
Well, my advice to you is never accept service with a gentleman who is as clever as that. I am loyal to Lord Peter and take great interest in the criminal cases he chooses to investigate, but for that I should have quitted his service long ago. Imagine for yourself, Jeeves, an employer whom you could never hope to deceive, someone who sees through every excuse and knows every trick. I'll be frank, Jeeves. It is not convenient at all. Do we want an employer who can tell where we have been from the clay on our boots, from the blonde hairs on our jacket lapel, from the smell of whiskey on our breath? No, we do not. So make your own choice now. Find the employer who meets your exact needs. He need not be mentally handicapped, but he should certainly be far from clever.
Impressed by this argument, Jeeves turned to the Junior Ganymede Club book and spent hours, more than that, he spent days, in studying the biographies pitilessly exposed therein. He browsed over names and nicknames, from Uffy Prosser to Catmeat Purbright, from Bingo Little to Gussie Fink Nottle. For stupidity, at least, many of them seemed to qualify, but some of them overdid it to the point of lunacy. Some who were ideal in other respects were obviously penniless. Several of the more prosperous were a shade too clever, and some few were of insufficiently good family. After exhaustive research, Jeeves found himself turning back repeatedly to an entry under Section W.
Name, Wooster, Bertram Wilberforce. Family, nephew of Sir George Wooster, baronet heir to the earldom of Yaxley. Status, bachelor. Income, ample. Educated, Eton and Magdalen, Oxford. Intelligence, out of a maximum of 10, 2. General notes. Lives in terror of his Aunt Agatha, but is on good terms with his Aunt Dahlia, who employs the inimitable cook Anatole. He is a member of the Drones Club and was at school or college with several other members. He will always go to the help of a friend, but often with disastrous results. Sounds just the job.
While Jeeves was not then sure that Wooster was the perfect employer, he thought that Bertram was far too good for his present valet, James Meadows, a member of the club with whom he had so far had little contact. He now made up for this past neglect, and saw to it one evening that Meadows' glass was never empty for long.
Bertram? Oh, you mean Bertie Wooster? He's a good fellow, you know. A very good fellow to work for.
Why do you say that, Mr. Meadows?
Obvious, isn't it? Because he can't count. He doesn't know how many socks he has, or how many handkerchiefs. Of course, he doesn't miss a few. And luckily, I take the same size in shirts.
But I'll bet you daren't wear his socks.
You're dead right, mate. But I know where I can sell them. Socks like these. I've got them in my pocket, see? Crimson with grey spots, see? I can get a good price for these.
Really? I wouldn't mind having a pair of those. And tell you what, I'll give you double the price you normally ask. How's that for a deal?
Done, my friend, and good value at that.
Later that evening, Jeeves put the socks into a large envelope and inserted with them a note in block capitals. Stolen by your man Meadows and sold to me, a well-wisher. He then posted the envelope to Bertram Wooster, Esquire, 6A, Crichton Mansions, Berkeley Street, West 1. 2 days later he called at that address and asked whether Mr. Wooster had a vacancy for a gentleman's personal gentleman. It seemed that he had. Bertie was under the impression that he had chosen Jeeves, approving a man who had been sent by an agency. But that is not what happened. Proust once remarked,
"It is a mistake to speak of a bad choice in love, since as soon as a choice exists, it can only be bad."
One thing that Wooster did not appreciate was that Jeeves' basic policy was to ensure that his employer should remain a bachelor. At the time of Jeeves' arrival, Bertie was actually engaged to Florence Cray. Jeeves put an end to this in a matter of days. Bertie was his chosen employer, and marriage for Bertie was out of the question. While effectively restrained from marrying, at least for a number of years, Bertie Wooster was not unappreciative of his female contemporaries. During the period of his actively social bachelorhood, his name was linked at various times with at least a dozen girls. The fact is that his bachelor status was constantly at risk, and it was only by extraordinary perspicacity and diligence that Jeeves was able to protect his master from a fate he considered worse than death: marriage. If Jeeves had, like Miss Jean Brodie, a prime, it must have been during his association with Bertie Wooster. Looking back on it, these years were principally divided between London and Worcestershire. We would be quite wrong, of course, to suppose that Jeeves was never outside that area. We know, for example, that his career began in Hampshire, and that his biographer cannot avoid reference to Sussex, Kent, Oxfordshire, and Somerset. In general, however, the Worcester country is fairly well defined, and there is no question of any civilized person going further north than Leicester or Shrewsbury. In the early years of the Jeeves-Wooster relationship, the most significant passages relate to one or other of two central themes. One is the character of Roberta Wickham, usually known as Bobby. The other, the growth of Jeeves' reputation as an advisor to all the young men about town. Of Bobby Wickham we have read several descriptions, and we should be justified in concluding that she was adorable, with auburn hair, perfect figure, and tip-tilted nose, pretty hands, and the sort of smile that lights up the whole neighbourhood. Bertie fell in love with her while staying for Christmas on Lady Wickham's invitation at Skelding's Hall. Jeeves, of course, promptly advised him against proposing to her using these words.
"Considered as a matrimonial prospect for a gentleman of your description, I cannot look upon her as suitable. In my opinion, Miss Wickham lacks seriousness, sir. She is too volatile and frivolous. To qualify as Miss Wickham's husband, a gentleman would need to possess a commanding personality and considerable strength of character."
Exactly. I quite agree.
I would also hesitate to commend as a life's companion a young lady with quite such a vivid shade of red hair. Red hair, sir, in my opinion, is exceedingly dangerous to matrimonial prospects.
Bertie scorned this advice as mere rubbish and prepared to enjoy the festive season. Having a slight grudge against Tuppy Glossop, a nephew of Sir Roderick Glossop and a fellow guest at Skelding's, Bertie mentioned the fact to Bobby. She advised him to tie a darning needle to the end of a long stick, enter Tuppy's room late at night, shove the needle through the bedclothes, and puncture Tuppy's hot water bottle. This had been a merely routine procedure at the girls' school which she had attended. Delighted with the idea, Bertie made the raid as planned, unaware that there had been a change of plans, and that the bed he was to assail was that of Sir Roderick. Needless to say, he was caught in the act. Sir Roderick, convinced that Bertie was insane, commandeered his room and left him to make what he could of a sodden bed. Hardly was Sir Roderick asleep when Tuppy entered what had been Bertie's room and punctured what he took to be Bertie's hot water bottle with a darning needle tied to the end of a stick. It transpired later that Bobby had made the suggestion to both of them, and Jeeves had been party to the double plot. Annoyed though he was with Jeeves, Bertie's love for Bobby died at that moment of history. His affair with Bobby a thing of the past. Great, therefore, was Bertie's surprise when a few weeks later Jeeves pointed out to him on the court page of the Times newspaper an announcement of the engagement between Bertram W. Wooster and Roberta Wickham. It was a moment for decisive action, and together with Jeeves, Bertie drove forthwith to Brinkley Court, where Bobby lived. There she calmly explained to him that she had fallen in love with Reginald Herring, known to his friends as Kipper, who was not returning her affection. The announcement in the Times was designed both to arouse Kipper's jealousy and to obtain her mother, Lady Wickham's, consent to the match.
You know Mummy hates you, Bertie.
Yes, old girl.
Well, I thought, you see, that if she saw you and I were engaged, she'd be absolutely jolly livid. So when I told her it was all off, don't you know, she'd be so pleased that she'd consent to the nuptials between me and Reggie absolutely pronto.
Jolly, yes, well, of course, I mean, absolutely.
You know I'm awfully fond of you, Bertie.
Really? Yes, of course, me too of you, old fruit.
But I can't marry everybody, can I?
I suppose not. Absolutely not. What?
Bobby's announcement in the Times having done the trick, she and Reggie became engaged. It looked for a while as if all her problems had been solved. In fact, they were only beginning. In Reggie, a strong man with a past reputation as an amateur boxer, Bobby had met rather more than her match. It was after he wrote a critical review of a novel which Lady Wickham had published under a pseudonym that Roberta began to have her doubts and suspect that Reggie was a domineering type. In the end, she broke off the engagement following an unusually dramatic quarrel, in the course of which he called her a carrot-topped Jezebel, and she called him a fat-headed nincompoop. On this note, an otherwise beautiful relationship was brought to an end. The other central theme which can be traced through the years when Jeeves and Bertie Wooster were together was the growth of Jeeves' prestige as an adviser about town. While it was Bertie's habit to reward Jeeves with fairly small sums of money when he extracted him from awkward situations, other young men were much more generous. He thus earned a considerable income, and while it is fair to say that as a butler he could never have been superior to Lord Emsworth's Beach, to Lord Ufferham's Kegs, or for that matter to his own uncle's silversmith, in the special world of the Drones Club and the Junior Ganymede, Jeeves gained an eminence which might, in another calling, have eluded him. In the world of gentlemen's personal gentlemen, Jeeves was one of the immortals. It could be said of him, and indeed often was, that he stood alone. Of Bertie Wooster's relatives, the most formidable, as we all know, was Aunt Agatha. She stood 5'9" in height and was topped off with a beaky nose, a lot of grey hair, and the eyes of a man-eating fish. To Bertie she was the aunt who ate broken bottles, killed rats with her teeth, wore barbed wire next to her skin, and turned periodically into a werewolf. She was not wholly unattractive in her younger days, and had been briefly engaged to the Honourable Percival Cray, but the fixture was scratched when she saw in her evening newspaper that he had been thrown out of a Covent Garden ball and arrested in company with a girl called Totty. Agatha eventually married a successful stockbroker called Spencer Gregson, who acquired Woolham Chersey Manor in Hertfordshire. Gregson she remained for much of her life, and presented an ungrateful world with her son Thomas, who combined his mother's ruthlessness with his father's commercial genius. Brought up with Thomas was Augustus Wooster, the only son of the late Henry Wooster, who had ended in a mental home. Gussie, who was, of course, Bertie's cousin, was a complete contrast to Thomas, a rather subdued character who seldom spoke. As for the Honourable Percival Cray, he became the Earl of Worplesdon, married and had 2 children, Lady Florence Cray, to whom Bertie was once briefly engaged, and Edwin, the Boy Scout, wisely avoided by everyone. The Earl was left a widower, and 30 years after the original engagement, married Agatha Spencer Gregson, now also widowed. They lived thereafter at his residence, Steeple Bumpley Hall in Hampshire. If Aunt Agatha had been overbearing before, she was doubly so as from the day when she became Countess of Worplesdon. But even she came to recognise that she had overdone the reign of terror where her nephew Gussie was concerned. Spiritless from childhood, he had been sent to Malvern House Preparatory School, where he had been, like Bertie, a pupil of the Reverend Aubrey Upjohn. Still further crushed at this hellish establishment, he went to one of the smaller public schools, and so to Oxford. Faced with this listless character, the Earl of Worplesdon applied the only remedy which would occur to the chairman and principal shareholder of the Pink Funnel Line. The boy should go to sea as assistant purser, and the experience would make a man of him. For a year or so, Gussie moved back and forth between Southampton and Montevideo, and then his ship was ordered to New York. From there, the Earl received 2 cables, one from his agents to say that Gussie had quitted his appointment and gone ashore, the other some weeks later from Gussie to say that he proposed to marry a vaudeville actress called Jacqueline Fitzroy. It would seem that years of repression had at last produced a feeble attempt at mutiny. Aunt Agatha's reaction was circumspect. She summoned Bertie Wooster to have lunch with her at Steeple Bumpley Hall and instructed him that he was to cross the Atlantic, find young Gussie, and persuade him to think again. One might wonder, as Aunt Agatha must have done, whether Bertie was the man to handle a delicate situation with finesse. No one could suppose that he was, but Jeeves would be with him, and it was on Jeeves' brains that Aunt Agatha had learnt to rely. Jeeves therefore hovered discreetly in the background, while Aunt Agatha briefed Bertie over lunch.
Such a woman would be a most unsuitable wife for any nephew of mine. So your mission is to break up the engagement. You must explain to Gussie that he must come home at once and marry into a proper family.
I get the idea, but can you tell me what is known about Miss Fitzroy?
We are given to understand that she appears in vaudeville. That's a type of stage entertainment in which short acts succeed each other, slapstick turns, song and dance routines, juggling performers, and so on.
Just so. What part does she perform?
She apparently assists the conjurer, handing him his hat and disposing of his rabbits. I see her as doing this in the minimum of clothing.
I can imagine. It'll be a pleasure, I'm sure, to carry out this mission.
The object of the exercise is not your enjoyment, Bertie. The object is to retrieve Gussie.
Yes, Aunt Agatha.
Arriving in New York, Bertie stayed briefly at the Algonquin, but moved soon afterwards to a flat in East 57th Street. It was Jeeves who found the flat, but it was the last service he was to perform for some weeks. He received an urgent telegram from his niece, Mabel Biffin, who was fishing with her absent-minded husband in Canada. Biffy had vanished while out fishing, and she was desperate. Could Jeeves come and help? Kind-hearted as ever, Bertie was willing to spare Jeeves, thinking that he now had a chance to show what he could accomplish on his own. Nor were his efforts initially misdirected. He discovered that the vaudeville shows on Broadway numbered 5. Of these, 2 had no conjurer, having performing animals instead. Obtaining programs for the other 3, he quickly ascertained that Jacqueline Fitzroy played her humble role at the Alhambra Palace in West 48th Street. It could not be said that her name was in lights, but it was there in the programme. Bertie decided to watch the stage door, feeling certain that Gussie must appear there before long. His patience was soon rewarded, and he hailed Gussie as a friend, explaining that he just happened to be passing, and it was a small world. It cannot be said that Gussie was unduly cordial on this occasion, but he reluctantly agreed to lunch with Bertie at Sardi's East. Over lunch, Gussie spoke of Jacqueline at length, her beauty, her talent, her brains, and her modesty.
Now, honestly, Bertie, she's a girl in a million.
If that's so, surely she would do better in Hollywood.
But I can't go to Hollywood, Bertie. I couldn't possibly part with her.
Leaving his cousin Gussie at Sardi's pondering on his love for Jacqueline Fitzroy, Bertie Wooster hurried off to visit those well-known Broadway theatrical agents, Finkelbaum and Grabstein. There he rapidly arranged with Mr. Finkelbaum, or it could have been Mr. Grabstein, that for the price of her fare to Los Angeles and a hefty commission, Jacqueline should have a screen test with the Perfecto Zisbaum Picture Corporation. Bertie stayed away from Gussie for a week, then rang him up and invited him to lunch at the Barbizon Plaza. The moment had come to talk Gussie into the idea of booking his passage to Southampton. But Gussie appeared in a rather belligerent mood. He approached Bertie, waving a newspaper over his head.
Have you seen this, Bertie?
Oh.
Well, listen to this. It's headed, Contract at First Sight. Mr. Levitsky of Perfecto Zisbaum has the name of a man who looks before he leaps, but he wasted no time when he saw the screen test of Miss Jacqueline Fitzroy, actress from Broadway, but signed her on for his new motion picture, Little Lord Fauntleroy. And listen to this. With her exceptional beauty and outstanding talent, her face, English accent, and distinguished poise, she's perfect for the part. All Mr. Levitsky needs now, for this new picture, is the perfect English butler. More difficult to find, he says, than an authentically aristocratic English lady. And then listen to this, Bertie. Readers of motion picture gossip are apt to suspect that stage names are all fictitious, and we were ourselves inclined to think that Miss Fitzroy's real name might be something less distinguished, like Huggins or Batty. However, our gossip columnist, Rita Prial, made a transatlantic call to the Duchess of Grafton, who told her that Jacqueline is the Duke's first cousin, and therefore a direct descendant of King Charles II. She's also a considerable heiress on her mother's side.
Alongside these paragraphs was a picture of Jacqueline, looking perfectly lovely and almost incredibly innocent. We should not go too far if we were to say that Bertie was taken aback. He could not imagine what this stunning girl could see in Gussie, but he could readily understand that Gussie would want to bring her back from Hollywood. It would involve the breaking of a contract with Perfecto Zisbaum, no laughing matter at any time. At this moment in the drama, Gussie did not know that Bertie was responsible for the disaster. It was Aunt Agatha who knew of his machinations, reported by mail, and who now realized how unfortunate his intervention had been. So the two young men dined together amicably, and Bertie braced himself to face the storm which would break shortly. Sure enough, it came, in the form of a cable from Aunt Agatha, in terms which were as unfair as they were unmerited, as eloquent as they were rude. Plunged into the depths of despair, Bertie knew not which way to turn. He was sitting forlornly on his bed, his head slumped in his hands, when there came a familiar, discreet tap on the door. Jeeves was back. Out of courtesy, Bertie first inquired after the missing Biffy.
Well, sir, the position was very much as I had anticipated. Mr. Biffin was hopelessly lost, and had forgotten the name of his hotel and the name of the place in which that hotel was situated.
So what did you do?
I made contact, sir, with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
Who always get their man.
Eventually, sir. Mr. Biffin was located yesterday and is now restored to his anxious wife.
But it's all a bit worrying, eh? He may get lost again at any time, after all.
No, sir. I have now provided against that. Mr. Biffin has a monomark and certain telephone numbers tattooed on his posterior.
Well done, Jeeves. A smart idea, but why on his bottom?
Because it won't show, sir, when Mr. Biffin goes swimming. And may I ask, sir, whether you yourself have had any crisis in my absence?
Have I? You will never know, Jeeves, what I have been through. I'll try all the same to give you the gist of it, the bare outline. You remember the problem about Mr. Augustus Wooster?
Following Bertie's description of the events leading up to the departure of Miss Fitzroy to Hollywood, Jeeves sat for some time in deep thought. Eventually, he suggested that the solution might lie in the contract with the film studios, and accordingly they both went round to Messrs. Finkelbaum and Grabstein's office to study a copy of the offending document. After reading it through twice, Jeeves stood up.
An interesting document, sir. Very precise about what she is to do and what she is to be paid. Not so detailed about what she is to refrain from doing.
What do you mean, Jeeves? I don't get the idea.
Well, sir, she has to be at the studio as directed and perform her part to the best of her ability. There is no clause to prevent her calling Mr. Levitsky a cheapskate whenever she sees him.
True, Jeeves. She might even call him a slob.
That might well be the term she would prefer to use, sir. Nor is it anywhere stated that she must not throw things at him.
Nor it is, Jeeves. I say, potatoes, for example?
Quite so, sir.
Any high-spirited girl might carry a bagful for that very purpose.
Or tomatoes, sir, as her mood might suggest. May I respectfully suggest that I depart at once for Los Angeles?
Bertie was at first inclined to go in person to Hollywood, but Jeeves dissuaded him, arguing that he would do better to stay in New York and write soothing letters to his aunt. Instead, Jeeves made the journey alone and met Miss Fitzroy at the Hollywood Knickerbocker Hotel. He had been quite right to assume that she was already bored with motion pictures, although he found she was too nice a girl to use the language he suggested. She was willing and eager, though, to throw tomatoes, but her aim was deplorable, and Mr. Levitsky was practically the only person on the set to remain unscathed. Jeeves sought for another solution for some days, and eventually it fell plump into his lap. It appeared Mr. Levitsky was still desperately searching for someone to play the vital role of butler. Since there were plenty of attractive young ladies in Hollywood, but only one Jeeves, he was reluctantly persuaded to cancel Jacqueline's contract. Jeeves immediately dispatched Jacqueline to New York, where she was met by Gussie with an armful of flowers and a proposal which was accepted. While waiting for Jeeves to finish shooting his star role in Hollywood, Bertie Wooster elected to remain in New York, well out of range of his Aunt Agatha. So after Gussie and Jacqueline sailed for Britain, he settled down to the social life he preferred. Among his friends was Ed Pollock, who one evening gave a dinner party at the Starlight Roof. The mixed party numbered about 20, and conspicuous among the guests was Mr. J. Washburn Stoker, accompanied by his daughter Pauline. She was a brunette with long straight hair, attractive figure, perfect oval face, and happy expression. Feeling at the time just a little jealous of his cousin Gussie, Bertie moved in with speed and asked her to join him and others in a picnic next day on Long Island. She accepted as they danced together, and it seemed to Bertie that his self-promotion scheme was going rather well. The picnic at Long Island was a great success. They held hands, and when she suggested a swim, he responded with enthusiasm, thinking that it might end with a romp in the shallows. It actually ended in a fast swim of something over a mile. He came in a bad second and somewhat exhausted, only to find that she had brought with her a volleyball, with which they played vigorously for about an hour. They ended the evening at a nightclub, and without the rest of the party. It was daylight when he saw her back to East 67th Street, and there, on the sidewalk, he asked her to marry him. When the engaged couple met again 2 days later, Pauline looked so solemn that Bertie wondered for a moment whether she too had suffered from exhaustion. He was soon undeceived on that score, but she told him nevertheless that there were dark clouds coming over the horizon.
You know, dearest, that my pa is related to George Stoker, the multi-millionaire.
Yes, Pauline, darling.
Well, darling, George is such a mental case that Pa sent for a specialist from London, Sir Roderick Glossop of Harley Street. It seems that Sir Roderick knows you, Bertie.
He should do, darling. I was once engaged to his frightful daughter, Honoria.
You were? Well, we could forget about that. The trouble is that he has told my pa that you are, in his opinion, a lunatic.
What absolute drivel.
Drivel or not, Pa believes him and thinks you a poor bed as a son-in-law. I've tried to talk him round, but I can't make him see reason.
They parted sadly, and the next day Bertie received a letter from Pauline.
My dear Bertie, I cannot convince Pa that you are sane. He merely reminds me that Sir Roderick is a world authority and ought to know. So he forbids our engagement and have no alternative but to break it off, and wish you better luck with another girl when Sir Roderick is somewhere else. With every good wish and a final kiss, Pauline.
Bertie sighed deeply and applied a handkerchief to wipe away the expected tear. He did not expect to recover for some days, nor to feel himself again until after Jeeves had returned, which he did a few days later. Together they sailed for England, and it was upon this voyage that Jeeves decided to give notice. He was sad, but resigned, for his new post meant promotion. He was to become a butler.